We're going to keep coming back until this war ends.
From the anti-segregation protests in the 60s that sparked the civil rights movement, to the 70s anti-Vietnam War demonstrations, and the movement against South African apartheid in the 80s, student protests have shaped the modern politics of the United States on numerous occasions. Fast forward to today, when campuses across the US have become battlegrounds with thousands of students demanding an end to Washington's support of Israel's brutal offensive in Gaza. A number of experts and historians recall similar protests in the US, but against a different war and under a different president, drawing parallels between Joe Biden's unwavering support for Israel's military offensive in Gaza and his refusal to meet student protesters' demands, with former President Lyndon B. Johnson's approach to the student-led anti-war movement in 1968.
We saw mass murder in Vietnam, carpet bombing of whole provinces, poisoning, chemical poisons of dioxin on fields and jungle, concentration camps. It was terrible, and we felt the moral impetus to act. They're doing the same thing.
Just like during the Vietnam War, the US is at present deeply divided on the issue of Gaza.
Once again, as in Vietnam, this is being done in our name as Americans and especially as Jews.
The Vietnam War, the longest war the US has so far been involved in its history, began in the early 1950s when Washington supported France's colonial claims over Vietnam to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, in what the US called the domino theory, according to which if one country fell to communism, the surrounding countries would follow suit, falling like dominoes.
But there is an old American saying that when the going gets tough, the tough gets going. So let no one doubt that we are in this battle as long as South Vietnam wants our support and needs our assistance to protect its freedom.
5 US presidents until the end of the war in 1975 propped up regimes in the Southeast Asian countries, spending over $170 billion and losing over 58,000 American soldiers against the Vietnamese rebel forces. In 1965, during Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency, the first US combat troops were sent into battle, and by 1967, there were around 500,000 US troops in Vietnam. The US's persistence in continuing the war, which killed an estimated 3 million Vietnamese, as well as its expanding operations, ignited anti-war demonstrations led by students across the country. In the meantime, Johnson was publicly assuring Americans that the Vietnam War was progressing well, but behind closed doors, the conflict had turned into a quagmire. Johnson failed to quell the student-led protests and ultimately withdrew from the presidential race in 1968. Numerous US administrations have justified human casualties in both Gaza and Vietnam and have put forth similar arguments for a scorched earth policy to bomb the two populations into submission.
My commitment to Israel, I want to make clear again, is ironclad. The security of Israel is critical.
Like in Vietnam, the war on Gaza has primarily focused on intense aerial bombardments in order to minimize casualties on the side of those waging the wars, resulting in mass casualties among Palestinian and Vietnamese civilians. Unlike during the Vietnam War, the US, this time along with its ally Israel, is faced with international criticism over its conduct over the course of the onslaught. The US was found guilty of committing genocide in Vietnam by an International War Crimes Tribunal, also known as the Russell Tribunal, in 1967. Today, South Africa's case accusing Israel of committing genocide is being heard at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Experts say that in supporting Tel Aviv militarily, the US may this time be complicit in what amounts to genocide.
I am thinking back, and other people are making this reference, that this may be Biden's Vietnam.
Bernie Sanders, an important ally of the Biden administration, has criticized Biden's blank check policy when it comes to Israel. Sanders, a student protester during the Vietnam War, knows that the protests across campuses for Gaza are shaping a critical narrative against Biden's upcoming presidential campaign. But as a student, Biden was indifferent towards the anti-war protests of the 70s. He did not oppose the war for its immorality, but because it was a product of lousy policy. Unlike in the Cold War era, today the US no longer controls the narrative. Several of its allies like France have called on Israel to permanently cease its assault on Gaza. Biden's support for Israel has increasingly isolated the US in global diplomatic circles. The UN General Assembly recently approved Palestine's bid to become a permanent UN member, with only 9 members voting against the move, including Israel and the US. The US's involvement in the war on Gaza is causing divisions among Americans across generational, racial, and class lines. A recent survey has shown that the country is divided on the student uprisings. While most Americans support a ceasefire in Gaza, half still oppose the protests. The longer Israel's military offensive persists, the more fierce the opposition will become, just like the escalations witnessed during the Vietnam War. And for Biden, whose policies towards Gaza have effectively polarized the country and earned him the nickname Genocide Joe, securing re-election is likely to become even tougher.